On May 23rd, Brighton High School welcomed town historian Mary Jo Lanphear for a presentation on the history of Brighton.
I'm so pleased to have so many people here. I know Mary Jo's message this morning is, yeah, this is about 200 years and Brighton's been around for 200 years, but you're Brighton's future, and we want to talk today about the future of Brighton as well as our past. So without further ado, here's town historian Mary Jo Lanphear.
Put some things away here. So we brought some history this morning, but it's not by any means a comprehensive history of the town. It's just what it says. It's snapshots of Brighton history. We're celebrating the bicentennial this year, and we thought we'd bring a little bit of history to you, especially what young people were doing and how they were living in times past. We're not going back to the beginning to 1814, but we'll highlight some of the memorable events. First, some background information and statistics. The town of Brighton in 1814 was huge. The northern border of the town was Lake Ontario, the western border was the Genesee River, and the east and south borders were the town of Pittsford. Over the years from 1823 to 1954, the village, then the city of Rochester, annexed much of Brighton's territory. The town of Irondequoit was taken off in 1839, so we lost our connection to the big lake. Brighton went from 29,000 acres and 45 square miles in 1814 to 6,500 acres and 10 square miles in 1954. Today, Brighton is 75% smaller than it was on the day of its first town meeting in 1814. There's an 1956 map, I think, which pretty much approximates what we look like today. Throughout the 19th century, most of the residents of Brighton farmed. Scattered around the town were small hamlets where farmers could go and have work done by blacksmiths or trade their produce for products that needed, or to go to church. Many of Brighton's early schools were located in these areas, such as Allen's Creek, over on the east side of town, West Brighton. That's school number 3 at Westfall and Clinton, and Landing Road. This is Brighton number 7 school on Landing Road North. The 12 Corners was also a small hamlet or village in Brighton, but the schools that served the population there were located to the west on Monroe Avenue, across from Cobb's Hill, or all the way down Elmwood Avenue at Clover Street. And here's that school, Brighton number 1. Can you imagine going to a school like that? Here are some of the kids from that school. You might have noticed that the school buildings in the pictures are smaller than today's schools, but the population was smaller than it is now. And more to the point, these schools were, for the most part, one-room buildings in which all the local children were educated from age 6 to 14 in the same room. Let's say you're living in 1914 and the school year is over for the year, so the children can help with the planting and the plowing. You've attained the highest level at the local grammar school, so what do you do now? After you left grammar school, your options were limited by family circumstances. First of all, Brighton didn't offer schooling beyond the 8th grade. There was no high school in Brighton until 1928. If you were lucky and your family didn't need you to work to supplement the household income, you might have gone to high school in the city of Rochester. None of the towns around Brighton had a high school either. The city opened the Rochester Central High School in 1857, converting an elementary school on Fitzhugh Street. In 1874, the Rochester Free Academy opened on the same street and became the Rochester High School in 1899. Crowding impelled the city school system to open in 1903 East High School on Alexander Street and in 1905 West High School on Genesee Street, marking the end of the Academy building as a high school. So how did you get to high school in the city? There were no school buses in those days, so the Brighton number 1 school district would not have provided you with transportation to East High School in the city. There was, however, public transportation available on Monroe Avenue. So again, if you were lucky and lived not far from Monroe Avenue, you could take an interurban railroad car that ran along the north side of Monroe Avenue into the city. Here's East High School. Okay, and there's the Monroe Avenue interurban. Some background on the mass transit system. Omnibuses and trolleys followed the first railroads. Rochester's first mass transit system began in 1863 with horse-drawn omnibuses with wooden wheels, very bumpy ride over cobblestone streets. Next came horse-drawn railway cars. A network of iron rails traversed by small cars with 4 iron wheels could be pulled by 1 or 2 horses or mules. Electric streetcars arrived in October of 1890. For far-reaching interurban travel, trolleys linked Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse, and many stops in between. That service ceased in 1931. If you lived closer, north of 12 Corners and closer to East Avenue, there was a streetcar that would take you into the city from the intersection of East Avenue and Winton Road. Perhaps you lived on a farm in Brighton that wasn't near Monroe Avenue. Perhaps your father allowed you to drive a horse and wagon to high school in Rochester. You'd look for a livery stable near the school and make arrangements with the proprietor to look after the horse and wagon while you were at class. That's what James Edmonds did when he finished his education at Brighton No. 3 School, across the street from the family's house at the center of Westfall Road and Clinton Avenue South. The Edmonds family house is where a medical building is now. Maybe high school in the city wasn't part of the picture for you. Perhaps your father worked at the Rochester Brick and Tile Company on Monroe Avenue near the 12 Corners. Rochester Brick and Tile had operated a brickworks there since 1853, occupying land on both sides of Monroe Avenue from Highland Avenue to the 12 Corners. But the clay that was the raw material that was almost gone from the center of Brighton, and workers were being laid off for lack of work. So in 1918, the company packed up all its equipment, including railroad tracks and cars, and moved to Fishers, New York, in the town of Victor, not far from Eastview Mall. That might have left your father without a job, so perhaps you would have given up education in order to go to work to help your family. Statistically, many young people did just that. An 8th grade education in 1914 was the equivalent of earning a high school diploma today. Your grade school education would have given you the skills needed to obtain employment. You might have found a job on one of Brighton's many farms. Throughout the 19th century, agriculture and brickmaking were the 2 principal occupations. Farmers always needed help with farm chores. The farm day was long and the work was necessary and seasonal. You might have noticed that I've been talking about education and/or jobs for young men and not mentioned the other gender. Young women in 1914 lived much more sheltered and controlled lives. They might have attended high school in the city if they weren't needed at home, and if they were able to obtain the car fare from their fathers. A young woman driving a horse and wagon to the city would have been unheard of. An option was boarding with a relative or close friend in the city during the school week and returning to Brighton on Friday for the weekend. Young women might have sought domestic employment, but also would have been limited in that work or to childcare. We've mentioned the 12 Corners a couple of times. During the Rochester Brick and Tile era, and this is a kind of a blurry shot taken from Cobb's Hill, looking down on Monroe Avenue. In the medium ground, you can just see a long, low shed, and that was part of the equipment for the tile works. This was a commercial district, the 12 Corners, providing services to the brick workers, farmers, and occasional travelers to Brighton. In the middle of the triangle, formed by the 3 streets, was a blacksmith shop. Because the streets were narrower back then, the triangle was bigger, so you could have a blacksmith shop in the middle of the triangle. In 1914, many people still used horses and mules to pull wagons and carriages, so a blacksmith was an important businessman at the 12 Corners. Maybe you found work with the blacksmith instead of attending high school. Daniel Sheehan operated a hotel at the northwest corner of Winton and Monroe, as did the heirs of Edward Capel, who built a brick tavern at 1832 Monroe Avenue. That's now the 12 Corners Apothecary. I'm sure you know where that is. Young men were always needed at hotels and taverns to fetch and carry, and the laws regarding young people's employment in such places had not yet been codified. Daniel Leary operated a hotel in the corner formed by the intersection of Elmwood and Monroe Avenue. That's kind of a classic picture. I think you'll see that on a lot of posters about the town. By 1950, Leary's hotel was gone, and the mobile gas station occupied the site. And there's still a gas station at that site. This is, you can see this middle school in the background there. Where the 12 Corners Plaza is now was the Peck Farm. Henry Peck had an apple orchard until about 1940, when it was cleared for the first shopping center of its kind in Monroe County. This picture is looking from roughly that gas station toward where the 12 Corners Plaza is today. So you can see it was heavily treed. Henry Peck had an apple orchard there. In the far distance on the far left is the Chateau restaurant, which was kind of a shady place, although people that went there said it was wonderful. So we'll see, the jury's still out on exactly whether it was a speakeasy or a fine dining restaurant. Where the 12 Corners Plaza was the Peck Farm. It might sound as if young people were all about school and work and lacked time for extracurricular pursuits. Not so. Having a good time was just as important in 1914 as it is today, only the options have changed. Automobiles were relatively new, and not every family had one. It wasn't until the 1920s that driving a car became commonplace. Going on a date in the pre-auto days meant visiting a girl in her home with her family present, or large group activities such as picnics, dances, or sleighing parties. A popular place for a picnic was Corbett's Glen. Now there's the 12 Corners before it's cleared. And there's a 1914 Dodge, might have been in the family garage. There's Corbett's Glen, the dance pavilion at Corbett's Glen. This was reachable by the interurban trolley system or by private vehicle. When young people finally obtained access to cars, they enjoyed a freedom that their predecessors could only dream of. And there's some more pictures of Corbett's Glen. On the sandhill there, a group has gathered for a photograph. A couple of ladies about your age in the stream at Corbett's Glen. Another couple of ladies and a young man in the stream. Music was often homemade, produced by someone at the piano with the latest sheet music. And here are some examples of popular music from 1914. How about Baby Boy? Don't Go Away. Aaron's Isle and You. Hello, Hawaii. Remember, Hawaii was kind of famous right about that time, around the early 1900s. In the town where I was born. Who paid the rent for Mrs. Van Winkle? I like that one. But that was Al Jolson. Al Jolson went on to have a very famous career. My Little Girl Down Home. He's a rag picker. Now, rag meant ragtime, not picking rags, not the cloth rag. Rose of the Moonlight, Sunbeam Sail, and this one's kind of interesting. We stand for peace while others war, with a picture of Woodrow Wilson, the president, on the cover of this music. This was 1914. What happened in 1914? World War I in August of 1914. So this is kind of interesting. And the lyrics were on the back, too, which is another interesting thing, the back of the sheet music, to have the words to the music. One could play music with a phonograph record on a Victrola, if you didn't want to play it on a piano with the sheet music. Phonograph records were made of hard wax, and early records were blank on one side. At that time, Samuel Levis's music store on South Avenue in Rochester was one source of sheet music, instruments, and records, and reachable from Brighton by streetcar. Levis's continued in business through the 1970s. In Brighton in the 1920s, there was a housing boom. Neighborhoods were springing up all over town with single-family and two-family houses. For families that didn't want to purchase houses, there were new apartment buildings along Monroe Avenue. There's the Georgian Court apartment building still standing after all these years. The building was built in 1925. And here's another one along Monroe Avenue. This is a building that combined a business on the first floor and apartments on the second floor. Built in 1925, it was rented by the town of Brighton as its first town hall from 1928 to 1953. I think you'll know the business that occupies this building today. That's kind of an old shot, but there's Malex. New housing in town meant more families and children, so the need for a local high school increased. In 1926, Brighton built a school for the lower grades at the 12 Corners Middle School, at the 12 Corners area, to relieve the crowding in school number 1 and number 8. In 1928, they added a wing to that building. Brighton opened its own high school in the same elementary school building, but later added a second wing to house the high school only, and that opened it to pupils from all the school districts then in Brighton, from 1 to 9, from West Brighton to East Brighton. With the prosperity of the 1920s came new appliances and household conveniences. Things that we take for granted today were novelties in the 1920s. Vacuum cleaners, refrigerators that made ice cubes, fresh fruits and vegetables at local markets, sliced bread, canned soup, breakfast cereals, and candy bars. The radio became commonplace. In 1924, there were 5 million radios in American homes providing news, music, and sports to listeners all over the country. It is said that the radio homogenized American popular culture as had no phenomenon before it. The increased prosperity of the 1920s allowed more children to stay in school through the high school years. Shop classes for boys and office practice for girls augmented the academic curriculum, ensuring the high school graduate of employment. Entertainment-wise, local movie palaces were cropping up in downtown Rochester, offering silent movies at first, then talkies by the end of the decade. This was the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, the era of the Charleston. So music and dance played an important part in the lives of young people. New methods of public transportation made the city more accessible from Brighton. In 1927, the subway opened from Brighton to the west side of the city. The subway was underground for only a short portion of the route through the city. On either side of downtown, it was surface transportation, running in the old Erie Canal bed. Here's a picture of the stop and turnaround at Rowlands, located near what's now Monroe Meadows and Interstate I-590. The subway ceased operation in 1956, and its eastern route is now part of Interstate 490. The end of the 1920s brought the collapse of the stock market and the beginning of the Great Depression. Housing construction continued in Brighton, but at a much slower pace. Neighborhoods such as Struckmar, with streets named Palmerston, Wilshire, and Monteroy, and Houston Barnard, with Ambassador Drive and Sandringham Road, were notable for amenities such as sidewalks, streetlights, and curb cuts leading to empty lots. The Depression of the 30s was a difficult time for Brighton families, with the father of the family often unemployed or underemployed. The town of Brighton stepped in by employing a welfare officer to ascertain need and arrange payment of medical bills, heating oil, groceries. Businesses closed. Young people had difficulty finding work, and if they did, their income was necessary to keep their families afloat. Entertainment at that time was home-based. The board game Monopoly was invented in 1933, and yes, this is the first Monopoly game. It was circular, not square as we know it. The home radio continued to offer music, drama, news, and sports in the pre-television age. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime was a popular song. Brighton High School added a wing to the existing building in 1935, but 4 years later contracted with architects C. Storrs Barrows and Charles Carpenter to design a new high school building on Winton Road that opened in 1941. World War II, beginning in 1941, brought significant changes to Brighton. The war-based economy thrived. Employment was available for both men and women. The material for housing construction was diverted to the war effort, so there was very little new housing in Brighton until after the war ended in 1945. And even after that date, key materials were scarce until the 1950s. During the war, people of all ages volunteered to help with the victory gardens, scrap drives, and war bond sales. Here's a slide of the scrap drive that occurred in 1942. They collected all sorts of metal, from bed springs to old iron stoves, anything that was made of metal that could be melted down for the war effort. In 1943, the town erected a 3-sided sign in the 12 Corners Triangle, honoring the men and women who were serving in World War II. This is a ceremony at that sign in 1950 when the sign was still there. Even dogs volunteered for service. One of Brighton's families enlisted their dog Chummy in the program Dogs for Defense. This newspaper clipping from the Democrat and Chronicle tells of her return to the Whig family on Willow Bend Road. I always thought this was kind of a nifty program. How many dogs would return from the war after doing sentry duty and other dangerous things? New to the 12 Corners in the 1940s was the Howard Johnson restaurant that occupied the land now in use by ESL Credit Union, the UPS store, and Aja Noodles. Hojo's was a popular place for after-school ice cream. Another interesting occurrence after the World War II era was the presence of the Coda kids in Brighton schools. These were the children of workers at Kodak's Harrow, England plant who were sent here by their parents to be sheltered by Kodak employees for the duration of the war. Aged 5 to 15, 156 children lived with families in Brighton and other Rochester area communities until it was safe to go home to England in 1945. Rationing was even more severe in England than it had been here in the U.S., so they not only missed their friends, they missed the abundance and variety of food they had known here. Here is Kodak kid Marjorie Garwood's picture in the Crossroads of 1944. Marjorie and other teenagers were listening and dancing to swing, bebop, and big band orchestras in the 1940s. By the way, the term teenaged was first used in the 1940s and popularized by Life magazine in December of 1944. After World War II was over, television became a reality for Brighton families with transmitters close by on Pinnacle Hill. The first sets were small, took several minutes to warm up, and offered programming for limited periods, usually from late afternoon to about midnight, when the station signed off for the night with the playing of the national anthem. Returning soldiers organized new radio stations in the Rochester area, including WVET, which were the call letters for Veterans Broadcasting System that had its operations center on Westfall Road, farmland in Brighton. WVET played pop music. Other returning soldiers opened seasonal hot dog and hamburger stands at Seabreeze. One of them, Don and Bob's, would open a satellite location on Monroe Avenue in Brighton in 1953 that remained open all year long and became an off-campus hub for after-school and after-game dining. The Canandaigua National Bank occupies that space today. Brighton experienced a series of gas explosions in September of 1951, making the national news. 15 houses in the Roselawn, Bel Air, and Meadowbrook subdivisions were destroyed, and 25 others badly damaged. 2 children died in one of the houses, and a woman died of a heart attack while being evacuated from the area. In the early 1950s, because of population increases, the Brighton Central School District could no longer accommodate high school students from the east and west sides of town. Unable to construct high school buildings in their districts, schools in East Brighton were annexed to Penfield and Pittsford, and schools in West Brighton joined Gates, Chili, and Rush Henrietta. This left Brighton Central School District better able to manage the schools in central Brighton, but segmented the town into 5 separate districts, losing the cohesion that characterized the first 150 years of education in Brighton. Ballads gave way to rock and roll in the 1950s when Elvis Presley became the top popular singer. Don't Be Cruel was issued in 1956. This Everly Brothers album was released in 1959. This was the era of the long playing record, the 33 1/3 RPM vinyl disc that replaced the single song 78 RPM record. One could stack a few records on a phonograph spindle and not have to attend to the machine for a couple of hours. Replacing the 78 RPM record was the 48 5 RPM single song disc that required a substantial spindle. Record stores carried adapters so one could play the 45 record on a slender spindle machine. And this is a slide of a Decca record, a small 45 record, but it's got an adapter in the middle that would allow it to go on that single adapter, on that single spindle. The 1960s saw the advent of the Vietnam War and the accompanying protests that were often reflected in the music of the day. The civil rights era that was just beginning was accompanied by new singing groups and soloists who were often African American. African American folk music was popularized by Odetta and Marian McKeeba. Groups such as Peter, Paul, and Mary, the New Christy Minstrels, and Simon and Garfunkel continued the tradition. Another important group of the 1960s had little to do with folk music and a lot to do with their own compositions. The Beatles arrived in the U.S. in 1964 and appeared on a national television show, and the rest, as they say, is history. In 1964, Brighton celebrated its sesquicentennial with events all year, especially a huge 4th of July parade on Monroe Avenue. The whole community came together to mark the 150 years of the town's existence. This is a slide of the Meadowbrook neighborhood float for that year. And there's another slide here that's kind of interesting. The Brighton Pittsford Post decided to have a stagecoach for their float. On the very, very back, on the far left, can you see a man with a horn wearing a hat? That person is Chuck Mangione. It was before he became nationally famous, and here he is riding on the back of the Brighton Pittsford Post coach in Brighton in 1964. The 12 Corners saw the advent of new stores in the 1970s, devoted to the making of bagels. Bagel Land opened in 1974 in 12 Corners Plaza, followed later by New York City Bagel and the Bagel Bin. Other bakeries in town were making bagels as part of their inventory, but a shop concentrating on one product was uncommon. And these bagel shops became very popular after school stops for Brighton students. 12 Corners Plaza has evolved over the years since its beginning. Wegmans was an anchor tenant in 1941, but closed the store in 1965 when Pittsford Plaza opened. Older residents recall Neisner's 5 and 10 cent store, the Crossroads restaurant, Altier's Shoes, and Earl's Drugs. In the 1920s, Brighton architect Leon Stern designed 3 Tudor-style firehouses for Brighton, one at East Avenue and Linden Avenue in East Brighton, one at Clover Street and Blossom Road, and the third at the 12 Corners. Although altered slightly, Brighton's number 2 on Elmwood Avenue remains in its original location. The Chateau Restaurant stood on the northwest corner of Monroe and Avenue and Winton Road. There it is, and was replaced by a gas station in 1957. A few years ago, a gazebo was built in the Triangle. So that's the 12 Corners in 2014. Do you think a Brighton student of 1914 would recognize the landscape should he or she return today? I hope you've seen this bicentennial logo around town. You see it in front of me here. You're seeing it on our lapels. And I'm sure being a Brighton student that you are, that you know the symbolism of the 3 lines that cross the logo? Yes. And with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
You've been watching a presentation by Brighton town historian Mary Jo Lanphear. A complete history on the town of Brighton, written by Mary Jo Lanphear, can be found at the website townofbrighton.org. For more information about Brighton bicentennial events, visit brighton200.org.